Sex and the City, Beyond Liberal Politics and Toward Holistic Revolutionary Practice by Diana C.S. Becerra. From the book Queering Anarchism by C.B. Daring, J. Rogue, Deric Shannon, and Abbey Volcano. This text retrieved from theanarchistlibrary.org. I was walking through the streets of downtown New York City to catch the uptown train to Harlem when I noticed a long line of enthusiastic fans waiting outside a movie theater to catch the latest film, Sex and the City 2. It triggered memories of my freshman year at City College and the nights I spent with friends watching old episodes of Sex and the City. A bit tipsy, we talked about our own sexual lives, comparing them to the often hysterical scenarios of that night's episode. But our experiences, in comparison to those of the four glamorous characters, were marked by blatant racial and class differences. We were three women of color who ate at family restaurants that blasted bachata and salsa, often way too loud, and who drank cheap beer instead of expensive cocktails, unless half off during happy hour. Sex and the City has been so influential that Natasha Walter, author of The New Feminism, felt compelled to say, quote, "I don't think anyone in the future will be able to write about the status of women in the U.S. at the turn of the century without running through some old Sex and the City videos and appreciating how single women bestrode Manhattan." End quote. But which single women? Of what race, class, and sexual orientation? And on what specific streets of Manhattan? Kim Ackes of London Metropolitan University argued that the show has provided women with a, quote, language with which to talk about their experiences and their friendships, end quote. Pepper Schwartz, a University of Washington sociology professor, claimed that Sex and the City, quote, was a sea of change in how women talked about sexuality, end quote. How is the discussion of sex being framed within Sex and the City? Just how liberating and inclusive is this sex talk? How does the show set the terms by which we understand our gendered and sexual selves? It is obvious that most of us could never afford the fabulous lifestyle promoted in the show, especially in this down-spiraling economy. Many of us are losing or have lost our jobs and homes, and are unable to pay for school, bills, etc. Given the show's blatant glorification of the lives of the rich and its large disdain for working-class culture, some more progressive folks may have the impulse to completely dismiss the show, calling it stupid and irrelevant. Meanwhile, the less critical may view the show as pure entertainment and fun, claiming that it has nothing to do with politics. But we must resist the temptation of dismissing popular culture. Popular culture circulates and reinforces many values that are seen as normal and natural. It's a powerful tool for educating the public about which relationships are acceptable and which are not. In celebrating the institutionalized social and material privileges of elite women, Sex and the City undermines its slightly progressive values. Informed by the basic assumptions of liberal feminism, Sex and the City normalizes the oppression of the majority of women and men. Liberal feminism has historically been characterized by its reformist political goals to incorporate racially and economically privileged cisgender women within dominant institutions. To take a step in a liberating direction, we need to understand how oppressive relationships are created and enforced in our communities. Given the complex people that we are, we need to understand how different types of privilege and oppression intersect and reinforce one another in both the experiences of others and ourselves. This type of framework can put us in a better position to holistically dismantle a sexuality that oppresses, and to create the conditions for a sexuality that liberates. From Gucci to Gramsci, Systems of oppression are maintained through the often coerced participation of the oppressed. But how does this happen? How are we compelled to participate within relationships and systems that oppress our communities and ourselves? This is precisely what the Italian revolutionary Antonio Gramsci asked in the early 1920s and 1930s. Gramsci developed the concept of hegemony to understand the process by which the working class is socialized to think and act within the dominant framework of class elites. But with the rise of nationalist, feminist, and sexual liberation movements in the later 20th century, many revolutionaries expanded the concept of hegemony to racial, gender, and sexual oppression. While we all have power, clearly some groups have much more power over their own lives, and unfortunately, even more power over the lives and deaths of others. The useful concept of hegemony allows us to understand how privileged groups maintain this power. Hegemony is maintained in large part through institutions, marriage, workplace, schools, military, etc., that educate people to accept and identify with the dominant assumptions, values, roles, and consciousness of their society and oppressors. The success of hegemony can often be measured by the inability of the oppressed to envision new alternatives, that somehow our misery is natural or even justified. Luckily, the hegemonic powers of privileged groups has its limits. Despite our intense socialization, we still have the ability, as human beings, to question our circumstances and to build alternatives. Sex and the City 101. It's important to know the show's plot before we analyze a show in relation to hegemony. Sex and the City portrays the lives of 4 single, elite, white, wealthy, heterosexual, thin women living fabulously in New York City during the late 90s to the early 2000s. The main character, Carrie Bradshaw, played by Sarah Jessica Parker, writes a witty sex column for the fictional newspaper The New York Star. Carrie uses her personal love life, the experiences and perspectives of her friends, Samantha Jones, Charlotte York, and Miranda Hobbs, and the dating scene of Manhattan as both her inspiration and writing material. The sex column serves as a space for Carrie to raise questions and outright doubts about the search for Mr. Right, marriage, and children. It is through Carrie's confession-style discussion of sex and relationships that the audience is invited to relate to the 4 characters. One of the most appealing and controversial aspects of the show was its blatant discussion of sex. As promoted in the show, women have the right to great sex, and also the right to discuss it everywhere. No social space in New York City is off limits. In Sex and the City, everything from careers to cunnilingus is discussed over expensive cocktails and cigarettes. And of course sex. All kinds of sex. Good sex, bad sex. Hit your head against a bedpost sex. Mind-blowing, I actually orgasm sex is discussed in hysterical detail. While the show mainly focused on heterosexual sex, non-heterosexual sex often made a guest appearance. Whether in the form of Samantha's brief relationship with Brazilian artist Maria Diego Reyes, the gay adventures of Stanford Bloch and Anthony Maritino, or, more problematically, Samantha's condescending interaction with transgender black sex workers. While Sex and the City provided insight into the lives of wealthy gay men and women, the show often promoted a binary of male, female, gay, and straight. As Charlotte commented about sexual identities, quote, "I'm all into labels. Pick a side and stay there. Boy, girl, end quote." This heterosexist statement treats sexuality as fixed and denies people, particularly queer and trans folks, the right to embody an identity that escapes the gender and sexual binary. Since hegemony is a process of domination, There is space for limited resistance and human agency to reject or question the expectations and roles demanded of certain social groups. Through humor, Sex and the City challenges the domestic roles assigned to financially privileged women. The show points to a new culture where female friendships, financial independence, female sexual empowerment, individuality, and personal choice are valued. We see this form of questioning in Sex and the City. The four female characters ridicule the expectations normally projected onto single women in their 30s. Romantic fantasies and notions about love are in a constant process of evaluation. Samantha rejects monogamy, embraces trisexuality, try anything once, and passionately defends a woman's right to always orgasm during sex. Samantha proudly admits, quote, "I have had to polish myself off once or twice. But yes, when I RSVP to a party, I make it my business to come." End quote. Samantha is the antithesis to the female stereotype that is desperately in search of a monogamous relationship. Another leading critic is Miranda, who sarcastically questions the double standard for men and women in regards to sex, financial independence, aging, and beauty, to name a few. Miranda is especially critical of romantic fantasies. Quote, "Soulmates only exist in the Hallmark aisle of Duane Reade drugs." End quote. Miranda even criticizes her friends for their often obsessive discussion of men, a subject matter that consumes a large portion of the women's time. Quote, "All we talk about anymore is Big Carrie's love interest, or balls, or small dicks. How does it happen that four such smart women have nothing to talk about but boyfriends? It's like 7th grade with bank accounts. What about us? What we think, we feel, we know. Christ, does it all have to be about them?" End quote. Miranda expresses her frustration of having to measure her happiness to the extent that her personal relationships with men are successful, i.e. long-term, and lead to marriage, despite her accomplishments as a corporate lawyer that grant her a sense of worth and financial independence. The constant discussion of men is equated with the stereotypical obsession of inexperienced young girls with boys. Overall, the show tries to highlight the power of female friendship, challenging the idea that women are entirely dependent on men for their emotional needs. It challenges the idea that you're nobody till you found somebody. As Michael Patrick King, the executive producer of Sex and the City, said, quote, "We get to say what no one would ever say to single people in their 30s, which is, maybe your life is better than the married people's." End quote. Although Charlotte, a leading character, is eager to get married, Sex and the City often suggests that happiness can be found outside marriage, and that not all women want a monogamous relationship or need to have children to be fulfilled in life. As the radical voices of the LGBTQ movement have suggested, marriage should not be legally, economically, or socially privileged above other relationships. Our vision of society should honor, respect, and materially support the diverse ways that people practice consensual love and to build communities beyond relationships of dominance. The majority of people, regardless of their gender and sexual identity, do not live in a traditional nuclear family. This is especially true of queer, people of color, and working-class communities who depend on extended families and friends for their well-being. The latter two households are often supported by single mothers. Confronting oppression. Through personal choice, the four characters of Sex and the City challenge gender roles. But how is empowerment being defined? Charlotte, in attempting to rationalize her decision to quit her job and become a housewife, says, quote, "The women's movement is supposed to be about choice, and if I choose to quit my job, that is my choice. It's my life and my choice. I choose my choice. I choose my choice." End quote. While it is the right of all parents to have the available resources to raise their children, the majority of women are not in the position of power to make Charlotte's choice. Any political project based around choice needs to critically question the options available to people, which for the majority are limited and outright oppressive. As we struggle to expand a person's fundamental right to make decisions about their lives, from the bedroom to the doctor's office and workplace, we have to recognize that institutionalized privilege grants some people more choices at direct or indirect expense of others. Individual choice, as a sole means of resistance, will always be limited by hierarchical institutions that deny us or others meaningful choice. Although speaking on white privilege, elements of Tim Wise's definition are useful for thinking about gender, sexual, and class privilege. Quote, white privilege refers to any advantage, opportunity, benefit, head start, or general protection from negative societal mistreatment which persons deemed white will typically enjoy, but what others will generally not enjoy. These benefits can be material, such as greater opportunity in the labor market, or greater net worth, due to a history in which whites had the ability to accumulate wealth to a greater extent than persons of color, social, such as presumptions of competence, creditworthiness, law-abidingness, intelligence, etc., or psychological, such as not having to worry about triggering negative stereotypes, rarely having to feel out of place, not having to worry about racial profiling, etc. End quote. Sex and the City defines social liberation around the privileges of wealthy, white, cisgender women, meaning women who perform the gender identity assigned to them at birth. Living in a gentrified apartment, buying $495 shoes, getting married, and hiring an immigrant nanny are all presented as the embodiment of feminist liberation. But how does the celebration of white female beauty and femininity, fabulous lifestyles, and wealth reinforce the oppression of working-class women, women of color, and LGBTQ persons? While Sex and the City honors the sexually assertive woman, and often critiques the sexism that rich women face in the corporate boardroom, the show ultimately points to the accomplishments of wealthy white women as proof of all women's gains. Informed by liberal feminism, the show celebrates women who assume powerful positions within dominant institutions. The individual women who enter these elite spaces are presented as the natural champions of women's rights. Challenging sexism is not simply about breaking gender stereotypes on an individual basis. Rather, it is about dismantling an institutionalized system of sexism, and by implication, other systems of oppression. Sex and the City assumes that all women experience sexism in the same manner, although apparently it is only rich, white, predominantly heterosexual women's experiences that are worthy of being presented. Women like Miranda or Samantha can climb the corporate ladder because of their class and racial privilege. So, for example, while the show celebrates Miranda's status as a corporate lawyer, it silences the experiences of Magda, a Ukrainian housekeeper whose domestic labor largely contributed to Miranda's success. The experiences of Miranda and Magda illustrate how a woman's class background and national status greatly impact her gendered experiences. Many wealthy white women can afford to buy themselves out of the gender division of labor within their home. These middle and upper class households depend on domestic workers to watch over their kids, clean their homes, and take care of all other domestic chores. The majority of domestic workers are poor women of color, often undocumented immigrants, who are overworked and receive less than minimum wage, while their employers are often white U.S.-born professionals and economically privileged. It is worth emphasizing that capitalism, heteropatriarchy, and white supremacy function on the unpaid work and poverty wages of the majority of women. This point is more than relevant In an age of global neoliberalism, where privatization, militarization, and the privileged access of corporations to cheap labor and natural resources is the rule. On a global scale, neoliberal policies that benefit U.S. and foreign elites are enforced through decrees or bullets. From devastating free trade agreements to U.S.-funded repressive governments and occupations, all which disproportionately affect non-white women and children. The logic and practice of militarization is guided by racism and heterosexism. Proponents of war exploit existing racist and sexist ideas to dehumanize civilians and justify their conquest. Civilians are, at best, seen as weak and racially inferior peoples in need of patriarchal protection, and at worst, the legitimate targets of violence, often sexual in nature. On a national scale, we witness expanding tax breaks to millionaires and corporations, funding of billions for war, all while critical social services are severely underfunded. The attacks on social services, such as childcare, healthcare, family planning, maternity leave, public education, and housing, to name a few, displace a societal and state responsibility onto the backs of individual women, thus perpetuating the gender division of labor and impoverishing women and their families. Of course, as the characters of Miranda and Magda suggest, not all women have access to the same resources to lessen the blow. To shift responsibility away from the actual policies and institutions that produce inequality, politicians conveniently scapegoat the degenerate identities and relationship practices, such as single parenting, non-monogamy, and non-heterosexual unions of marginalized communities. The hierarchies that exist between women demonstrate that race, class, and sexuality are equally important in shaping the oppression of women and the patriarchal privileges of men. In short, patriarchy does not equally oppress all women, and not all men equally benefit from sexism. If we fail to recognize this point, we perpetuate the exploitation of marginalized people. In her classic work, Feminist Theory, From Margin to Center, Bell Hooks says, quote, "White women and black men have it both ways. They can act as oppressor or be oppressed. Black men may be victimized by racism, but sexism allows them to act as exploiters and oppressors of women. White women may be victimized by sexism, but racism enables them to act as exploiters and oppressors of black people." End quote. And we might add that heterosexuals of any color can also perpetuate the oppression of queer and trans folks. To avoid reproducing inequality, social movements must affirm the distinct experiences of oppressed peoples and be guided by the experiences, demands, and visions of these communities. Revolution, a struggle that never goes out of style. The liberal feminism that informs sex and the city cannot successfully address the systematic nature of women's oppression because it expands the privileges of elite women at the expense and continued oppression of others. Radical social movements must challenge one of the most unquestioned assumptions of liberal movements, that inclusion into dominant institutions is in and of itself social liberation. Amidst military and prison scandals of systematic rape and torture, not to mention multiple U.S. wars overseas, the inclusion of women, people of color, LGBTQ folks, and undocumented youth into extremely misogynistic, racist, and capitalist institutions, such as corporations, the military, and police, has life and death consequences. As prison abolitionist Angela Davis warns, inclusion into oppressive institutions offers marginalized peoples the equal opportunity to perpetuate male dominance and racism, and one might add class oppression, imperialism, and environmental destruction as well. Our liberation from heteropatriarchy is intimately tied to the struggle to dismantle racism, capitalism, and an authoritarian state. In other words, our movements need to understand and confront how systems of oppression, capitalism, heteropatriarchy, and white supremacy intersect and reproduce one another. A social movement that prioritizes one form of oppression over another fails to address the power of hegemony. Simply put, a reductionist analysis fails to address how privilege and oppression are embodied within existing institutions and identities. Revolutionary praxis, the relationship between theory and practice, can only be developed through our participation in grassroots movements. Through struggle, we build consciousness and leadership. We educate ourselves and others, and we prefigure the world we want to live in. In short, we build people power and a critical mass to restructure power. While we aim to decenter the authority of the state, we need to utilize state institutions in the now to democratize access to vital social services. In specific contexts, electoral strategies might even be appropriate in order to push forth progressive policies. This has certainly been the case with the rise of popular movements and progressive governments in Latin America. However, as popular movements struggle within existing institutions to win necessary reforms that improve people's everyday lives, the institutions that create miserable conditions in the first place must not go unchallenged. In other words, our struggle does not end with the winning of a particular reform, but rather, we must confront the sources of oppression. Fighting oppression is a collective struggle and an ideological and institutional battle. It requires the cultivation of a new form of consciousness that challenges the legitimacy of existing ideas and practices. We have to unlearn our oppressive roles and beliefs, and learn new ways of valuing, respecting, and loving one another. But sustaining new relationships demands new forms of organizing society. The struggle against sexual and gender oppression is an important component of a larger struggle to transform and establish a new society. A liberatory sexuality and society is only possible with the transformation and creation of alternative institutions that are democratic, decentralized, empowering, and participatory. Alternative institutions that embody a different set of values: love, affirmation, consent, respect, justice, autonomy, and solidarity, to name a few. The project of Queering Anarchism would possibly not only analyze popular culture, but would also redefine it and link together struggles against oppression into a holistic vision of systematic change. Inspired by the pro-democracy revolutions in the Middle East, and armed only with their values and ideas, New Yorkers who occupied Zuccotti Park in the center of Wall Street have presented a radically different vision of the city. Occupy Wall Street, the anti-foreclosure movement, and the opposition to stop-and-frisk policies and other struggles, which advance the rights of women, immigrants, working families, the homeless, and trans and queer persons, all bring to light that which media, from Sex and the City to newsrooms, obscure: the stark and growing inequality that makes New York the most unequal state in the United States. Communities that existed on the margins of Sex and the City, communities in Harlem, the Bronx, Queens, Brooklyn, and Staten Island, have taken center stage to hold accountable elites who can profit from the majority behind police barricades, banks, or luxury apartments. Popular struggles also present another vision of sex, where consent is crucial and celebrated, where gender is fluid and non-hierarchical, where women, trans and queer persons, and sex workers can walk the streets free of fear, where men of color are no longer shot and brutalized in the name of upholding law and order and allegedly protecting us from racialized thugs and predators, where communities have the necessary resources, including time, space, and goods, to live and maintain their culture. The eruption of global protest movements in 2011, from New York and La Paz to Cairo and Tokyo, all demonstrate that an alternative vision of sex and the city is not only necessary, but possible. And, in the words of Carrie Bradshaw, well, that's just fabulous.